When a cold case was solved after 4 decades, it was due to the victim herself catching her killer. Evidence that the murderer didn't even know was possible at the time when he committed this crime. All these years later, 2 more strange deaths were found within the killer's family. But was he involved? You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I am Brooke Makenna, and this case is incredible how long it took for justice to be served, because so many investigators, so many people in this community refused to let it go unsolved forever. And even though it took so much longer than the average case, they ended up solving it and catching a killer. And actually, it was the victim who was the reason that this killer could be caught in the first place. So we will get all into that. But first, let's take a moment for our sponsor, Body Restore. Body Restore shower steamers have been a lifesaver for my relaxation during this cross-country move into my new house. It's actually made me look forward to having this nice, hot, relaxing shower at the end of the day with the best smelling aromatherapy steamers. I use lavender and milk honey for when I want to wind down at night, and also in the mornings when I need to wake up and be refreshed, I'll use the eucalyptus mint or the fresh tea tree. They have scents for any mood you could possibly be in, and they're made with natural essential oils. I just pop one on the shower floor right outside of the main stream of the water, and as the shower warms up, the whole room is enveloped with this scent. It's not an overwhelming headache-inducing scent, but it really is so fragrant. So I highly recommend you use the link in my description. Use the promo code BrookeMac20 for 20% off your own collector's box, which actually comes with 10 different kinds of scents. I'm absolutely obsessed. I've smelled all of them, and seriously, there's none that I don't like. So check it out down below, upgrade your shower routine, and a thank you to Body Restore for allowing me to make these videos. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1979 in Iowa, and Michelle Martinko lived in Cedar Rapids. She was an 18-year-old attending Cedar Rapids Kennedy High School. She had been born to Albert and Janet and was the youngest of 2 girls, her sister being Janelle. But she was well known by school officials for being a wonderful student. She was also incredible at twirling, at choir, at theater, and she planned to go to Iowa State University and study interior design. She was said to be stylish all around. She loved dressing up, doing her makeup, standing out, and it was because of this that Michelle would face a lot of jealousy within her own classmates. She didn't have many girlfriends, and this was actually due to an incident that had happened with a boy she had dated and some conflict with the other girls. It wasn't too serious, just some high school drama, and after this it was said that Michelle really kept mostly to herself, though she did have a few friends in her extracurricular programs that she was a part of. She was really known to be quite mature, sweet, and kind, and especially independent. But on December 19th of 1979, Michelle would go to a banquet with the choir at the local Sheraton Inn, and once it was over, Michelle had left this hotel. By 2 a.m., she had not returned home, and her father, Albert, reported her missing and began searching for her immediately. She was said to be wearing a black jersey dress, black scarf, black pantyhose with heels, and a waist-length white and brown rabbit fur jacket. She was also carrying a brown leather purse. At 4 a.m., Michelle would be located, but this wasn't a positive. You see, the family's car, a tan and green 1972 Buick Electra, which Michelle drove, was parked in a parking lot of the Westdale Mall. Officer James Kincaid had been dispatched to look for Michelle, and so he got to this Westdale Mall, and he found this car halfway between JCPenney's and the bank, and he found that the driver's rear door was unlocked. So he opened the door, and he saw Michelle slouched down in the passenger seat, and he went over to the passenger door and he saw that she was covered in blood. She also had a laceration on her chin, and her dress was pulled up around her waist. An autopsy revealed that 18-year-old Michelle, who was about to start the rest of her life, had been wounded 29 times in the face and the chest. She'd been stabbed 11, and 2 of those penetrated her lungs. Her aorta was also pierced. She had lost a third of her blood capacity. But her hands were the most telling. They had severe defense wounds. Michelle had fought against her killer. She had fought for her life and appeared as though she had been pushed down on her back. but the ME determined that her time of death was between 8 and 10 p.m. and the murder weapon was a sharp-pointed object, but not definitively a knife, and the ME didn't know the size. Thankfully, it was determined that she was not sexually assaulted and she was still fully dressed. Investigators believe that this homicide was personal in nature, and at the crime scene, they found no blood outside of the car, only inside, as though this attack had fully happened inside the vehicle. There were no fingerprints at the crime scene, and money remained in Michelle's purse, so this wasn't a robbery. When the vehicle was processed, blood was found on the front seats of the car, the dash, the windshield, the visors, and the headliner. There was also blood on the gear shift lever and the steering wheel. A police spokesperson had told the public that everyone's instinct was that this was a guy who had killed her, but they couldn't eliminate a woman at this point. And a fellow choir student named Jane Hanson came forward to say that Michelle had asked her if she wanted to join her on a shopping trip after the banquet. The friend declined due to needing to do some homework, but Michelle said that she was going to go to Westdale Mall. It had only been open for around 2 months at this point. This is actually where Michelle worked at a clothing store named Brooks. So she knew the area. She knew that the mall closed around 10 p.m. and she said she was going to go buy a new winter coat that her mom had put on layaway. But this friend Jane said that she got a call in the middle of the night from Michelle's mother, who sounded frantic, asking her if she knew where Michelle was. Another friend then came forward saying that Michelle had asked them to go to the mall, and at first they had said yes, but then they changed their minds, so Michelle had gone alone. This was around 6:30 p.m. and witnesses at the mall said that she was going in and out of stores, she was speaking with coworkers, she was speaking with friends she was seeing there. And Tracy Price was one of the guys that went to school with Michelle, and he said that he and 3 friends were going to the movies to see The Jerk, but they had stopped at the mall to just hang out for a bit around 7 p.m. and they ran into Michelle. She told them that she was picking up a new coat. She then showed them a wad of cash that was around $200, and Tracy was told her to put it away because he didn't want anyone to see what she had. The last time any witness had said that they had seen Michelle was around 9 p.m. outside of a jewelry store. And around 11 p.m., a manager at Pier 1 Imports who worked in the mall said that they had taken the store's money to the bank drop box, which was where her car would be located. And this manager said that she saw Michelle's car parked there by itself. But 5 hours later, she was found deceased, and that nearly $200 was still in her possession. The next day at school, the news quickly spread that one of their classmates was deceased, and Michelle's mother did tell the Cedar Rapids Gazette that her daughter was gentle and had a beautiful voice, she loved music, and that she didn't have any school problems, and when she wanted something, she would just write it down and achieve it. But Janet didn't think she would ever get over her daughter's murder and didn't think it would ever be solved. Over the next week, police received around 200 tips. They were interviewing possible suspects, giving polygraph tests. There was one boy who was on police's radar because when he was located just walking in the area, he was carrying a knife. However, he was eventually ruled out. Then a mall employee became suspicious because he told police he enjoyed following women around and oogling store mannequins while he was working. He too was ruled out. Then the prime suspect was a man who had broken into a Cedar Rapids home the month prior to Michelle's murder. He had raped a woman at knife point and then threatened to kill her children. He denied the accusations, and this is when he was sentenced for rape. This was a man named Dennis Lee McKee, and he was sent to prison on August 6th of 1980. Investigators began to suspect him after finding in his car shortly after Michelle's death that he had fur that matched the rabbit fur coat that Michelle was wearing that night. He was never arrested for her murder though, but many believed he was the killer. However, her family had a different theory because Michelle's family believed that due to the personal nature of the killing, Michelle's ex-boyfriend, who was Charles Siddell, who went by Andy, had killed her. Andy and Michelle had a 2-year-long relationship, but they broke up, and after this, Andy didn't seem to want to leave her alone. He was always around, always wanted to know where she was. However, police claim that he was never a serious suspect in the case, even though Andy admitted to running into Michelle at the mall that night because he was there buying her a Christmas present. You see, during the interrogation, Andy would say that they had first met at a roller skating rink. Michelle was struggling and he helped her. They had a passion for pizza and they began dating. Andy admitted that when he had seen Michelle at the mall that night, he told her not to follow him because he was going to buy her a present. He said Michelle asked if she could call later and seemed happy. But that's not all Andy said, because he would also say that Michelle had told him recently that she was being followed or watched. This was by a grotesquely ugly man while she was working at the clothing store at the mall. Andy said that Michelle seemed intensely bothered by this and was really quiet a week before her disappearance. But Michelle's family said that Andy was possessive. They didn't really like him, but he had this alibi that he was home the night of the murder. However, it was his mother who was giving him that alibi, so they didn't know if they could trust it. Then at Michelle's funeral, he went right up to the casket, wrapped his arms around Michelle, and was sobbing. And then he began asking Michelle's mom if she loved him, if he was the only one she loved at the time. There were rumors spreading around town that Michelle had been receiving harassing phone calls prior to the murder. However, investigators found no evidence of this. Some believed, the residents especially, that police were actually trying to cover up for the killer and that this killer had committed a second stabbing a few days later. Investigators denied this though. Investigators had the theory that Michelle's car had been in a different spot than they had found it in that parking lot from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. That she might have been in the parking lot that was in front of JCPenney's and then it was later moved behind. 5 months after the murder, a huge tip finally came in, and a woman said she had come forward much earlier to the daughter of the secretary of the public safety commissioner, and she believed that they were going to give information to the police. When she realized that they didn't, she contacted the police herself. She claimed that that night of Michelle's murder, she was at a Christmas dance with her family, and then she and some coworkers went to the Sheraton Inn. She didn't drink, so she took a friend home that night who lived near Westdale Mall. This was in the early mornings of December 20th, around 2 a.m., when Michelle still hadn't arrived home and her parents were getting suspicious. This woman was actually at the mall checking for her own daughter's vehicle because her daughter worked there and would sometimes have car trouble. But she would see 2 cars in the parking lot. Neither belonged to her daughter, but she would see a man standing next to the open driver's side door with a woman inside. When she stopped her car to see what was happening, this man seemed to lean closer into the car as though he was concealing something. She said she didn't know why she stopped, but then she just thought it was maybe kids partying or kids on drugs, and so she went on her own way. After hearing about Michelle's case, though, she said that the car the man was standing by was Michelle's car. And since the information took months to get to police, detectives did consider charging the commissioner with failure to pass along information, but ultimately this didn't happen. They were no closer in finding this killer anyways. 6 months after the murder, and a composite sketch was released. However, it had been created by witnesses under hypnosis. This was something that the police had been doing with their witnesses and suspects. Around 30 of them had been interviewed under hypnosis. 2 witnesses, one being the woman who saw the man leaning over Michelle's car, would say that they had seen a white man in his late teens or early 20s, around 6 feet, weighing 165 to 175 pounds, with brown eyes and curly brown hair. Again, this was released and a killer wasn't named. No one recognized this man from the sketch, or they didn't come forward if they did. Around a year in, the Lynn County attorneys took over the investigation and they were calling witnesses. They were reviewing police reports, but for the next few years, the case grew cold. Michelle's father, Albert, actually decided to file a lawsuit against the owners of the Westdale Mall for negligence and not providing reasonable security the night of the murder. He was fighting for even a small amount of justice for his daughter. However, this case was appealed, and then Iowa Supreme Court ruled in favor of the mall owners. While Michelle's parents searched for answers, the case didn't budge, and they would pass away before any movement would be made. Those who knew them said that Michelle's mother felt everything so deeply and that this destroyed her, and her father was consumed with anger. And they went to their graves believing that Michelle's killer was her ex-boyfriend.
Well, from the very beginning, I'd like to say that she was sort of our miracle baby, because my mother was 44 when she had my sister, and there's 12 years difference in our ages. So she had tried all those years to have children. with no success, even tried to adopt. And so when my sister came along, she was just the world and all to us. And she was a beautiful little girl and healthy, and all the things you are concerned about. And as a child, she was the happiest little girl you'd ever want to meet. As a matter of fact, my mother even asked the doctor if there was something wrong with her because she didn't cry. And she was just very, very sweet from the very, very beginning. All the time we had together, we did dolls and dress up, and she was very, very feminine. And I was the tomboy. So she was a totally new experience for me. She was my little doll and my little, plaything. It was so much fun. And my mother just adored her. As she grew up, my mother and my sister were soulmates. The singing, the fashion, the decorating, all of those things, the dolls that my mother kept encouraging me to play with that I just never could get into. So, my mother and my sister had a very, very special relationship that way. My mother's comment that they didn't want her money, they didn't want her sexually, they just wanted her life. And that just was not something we could understand.
Your mom was not totally surprised by this?
She was not.
She had a feeling?
Yeah, she had more than a feeling. And it was one of those things that she didn't tell us about that right away. It was not the first thing we were discussing at all. But within about 2 weeks, she said, I was not surprised. Part of the reason that night, when my sister did not come home, she knew exactly what happened because she had had a dream that, and there was a newspaper, and it said, Michelle was murdered. And my mother had had a little bit of a history of that sort of thing when she was living in Chicago as a young woman, and her father back in Dubuque died. She saw him in her room. So she was a little bit different that way. My mother just didn't go out of the house anymore, didn't want to talk to people, terribly depressed, could barely watch the news or the newspaper. My father wound up having a stroke and had to quit work early, and then she took care of him. Their lives were destroyed. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. And when people say, oh, you're having family for Christmas or whatever, and do you have sisters or brothers? And I said, I used to.
But in 2002 and 2003, DNA testing was done from the blood found in the vehicle and on Michelle. 5 different locations were found on her dress believed to be her own DNA. The blood from the gear shift lever, however, was a mixed profile of female and male DNA. Then in 2005, a cold case investigator for Cedar Rapids PD received a tip, and this caused him to look further into Michelle's case in its entirety. And although this tip didn't give him answers, he would find unidentified DNA on the dress that Michelle was wearing when she was murdered that had yet to be tested. So 4 more locations of blood was tested from this dress, and a male profile was found, and they could not exclude it from being the same male DNA mixed with the female DNA on the gear shift. This DNA found, the male profile, allowed them to build a partial DNA profile. This blood that they had found was only there due to Michelle putting up a fight for her life. As she fought off this killer, she had hurt him enough that he had bled on her. And that evidence remained years later. This profile was entered into CODIS. However, this profile did not match any of the convicted criminals in the database, meaning that the man who was once their prime suspect, Dennis Lee McKee, who had raped that woman and threatened to kill her kids, was not a match either because he was already in prison. In fact, he died in prison from colon cancer. And prior to this, he had told the Gazette that he did not murder Michelle. The officers were just crazy and desperate. At this time, because they had this profile, Andy Siddell, Michelle's ex, voluntarily gave his DNA after being suspected for so many years, and finally he was eliminated as the killer. 8 years later, police were given a possible suspect via Crime Stoppers tip. Their DNA profile was tested against this individual, but it was not a match. So 4 months later, in April 2014, police would hold a press conference asking this anonymous Crime Stopper tipsters to come forward because the information they provided was credible and they wanted to know more. The next year in 2015, 36 years since the murder, Detective Matt Dinlinger took over this case, and he had a personal connection to it because his father, Detective Harvey Dinlinger, worked Michelle's case when she had first been murdered. A few years later, Parabon Nanolabs, who specialized in DNA phenotyping, were hired to create an image of this killer based on his DNA using physical appearance and ancestry. Detective Matt Dinlinger had heard about this process as well as the genetic genealogy after the capture of the Golden State Killer using this process. So Parabon Nanolabs created this image of a man with blonde hair, blue eyes, white, and they were able to make this image of what this man could have looked like when he murdered Michelle and what he might look like today. Now, this was a completely different image than the one made by witnesses prior who were under hypnosis. But these new photos were released to the public for identification, and during the press conference, a former classmate of Michelle's exclaimed that this looked like one of their classmates, a classmate who had been investigated and cleared based on a DNA swab. However, that nor any of the hundreds of tips that were coming in panned out in solving this case. However, in 2018, a partial DNA profile was submitted to GEDmatch, a public genealogy website, and this is when they would finally get a match. A distant relative of their killer had uploaded her DNA onto this website, and she was the second cousin once removed of the killer. So a family tree was created starting with 4 sets of this woman's great-great-grandparents. 2 branches of the family tree had their DNA tested and they were eliminated, and a 3rd branch found that they were first cousins with the killer. It was then narrowed down to 3 brothers who had grown up in Manchester, Iowa, and were all young men at the time of Michelle's murder. This was Ken, Don, and Jerry Burns. Detective Dinlinger and his force then began surveillance of these 3 brothers with the aim to gather their DNA secretly and conclude which one of them was the killer. So all 3 of these items had been collected without them ever knowing that they were being sent off to be tested. 2 were not a match, and then on October 29th of 2018, one of the brothers was at a restaurant in their hometown, and after he left, investigators collected the straw he was drinking out of. The straw was submitted for testing, and the lab found that his DNA could not be excluded as the killer's. So after 39 years, investigators had hoped that they would catch a killer and solve this case. Jerry Burns could be Michelle's killer. He had been 25 years old at the time, and 2 months after this, on December 19th of 2018, on the anniversary of Michelle's murder, the detectives went to Jerry's job to talk to him. And while they asked him questions, he refused to give a sample of his DNA. He said he didn't know what they were talking about. However, because of the DNA on his straw, detectives already had a warrant to obtain an actual DNA sample from him. He was arrested, and his hands and arms were photographed for possible scars that had been left by Michelle fighting back and causing his blood to be on her. Jerry told police he did not know this victim and how she died. Every time he was asked if he had killed someone, he told them to test the DNA. His full profile DNA was then tested, and it matched the blood on Michelle's dress. Jerry had no explanation for this. His DNA also couldn't be excluded from the DNA found on the gear shift sample, though they still could not identify whether his DNA came from blood, sweat, saliva, or semen. They did know it was a match. When detectives searched Jerry's phone for internet history, only calls and texts were found to be made on the phone. So then they had a search warrant for his phone and office computers. And his office computer included searches of blonde females, assault, rape, strangulation, murder, abuse, rape of a deceased individual, and cannibalism. But due to this evidence that Michelle had left for investigators to find, she caught her own killer. Jerry Burns was charged with first-degree murder, and his bail was set at $5 million cash. Before his trial, Jerry did file a motion to suppress the result of the warrantless search of his DNA from the straw that detectives collected. He said this was a violation of his 4th and 14th Amendment rights to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. This was denied, though, due to Gary leaving the restaurant without the straw, meaning he relinquished any expectation of privacy of the straw and his DNA on the straw. Then the relative who had uploaded her DNA onto GEDmatch came forward to the Gazette. This is Brandy Jennings, who lived in Vancouver, Washington, and she said that she had uploaded it to learn more about her father's side of the family after he died in 2009. But then she forgot about it, and she never expected that her DNA would help catch a killer. She was Jerry's second cousin, twice removed through her paternal great-grandparents, and detectives had called her up, and she was saying that her brother had been worried about her putting her DNA on this website because he wouldn't want to be responsible for getting a family member arrested. Brandy said that this wasn't even something she worried about, and she doesn't regret it. Jerry Burns had been 25 years old at the time of the murder and had just turned 65 when arrested. At the time of the murder, he was married with 2 kids, and now he was a respectable business owner of a powder coating business. He had previously worked for John Deere and co-owned a truck stop. He had no criminal record. However, he had married a woman named Patricia, and she died from a suicide in 2008. And oddly enough, Jerry's own cousin Brian had vanished on December 19th, 2013, the 34th anniversary of Michelle's murder. He was considered physically or mentally disabled, and he had still not been found at the time of Jerry's arrest for murder, though investigators did not believe he was involved in either of these cases. Jerry's trial was meant to start in October 2019, though he requested a venue change and a need for more time, and so then it was scheduled February 10th, 2022 in Scott County instead. A judge determined that the internet searches found on Jerry's computer were unusable in the murder of Michelle because it happened so long after she had been killed, but Jerry pled not guilty. In the first week of the trial, the focus was on how the evidence was collected and maintained over decades. The defense claimed that it wasn't properly handled and maintained, and that Michelle's clothing was all put into one evidence bag. But multiple experts were brought to the stand, and they said at the time it was common for similar items to be packaged together. The pathologist who had conducted Michelle's autopsy, named Richard Feister, testified that she had 29 sharp edge wounds but had been stabbed 11 times, and she had slice marks in between her fingers, which were textbook defense wounds. She was in a lot of motion during the time of her murder. The crime scene photographer Richard White then testified that the morning that they found Michelle was his birthday, so he remembered it so well. He believed that the car had been parked in a hurry as the back left tire was over the line. He also noticed a chevron type pattern in blood inside the car and on the door handle. So he went and he bought some regular dishwashing gloves, and the pattern matched. Detective Matt Dinlinger then testified about the interview that he conducted on Jerry. He had asked Jerry to walk him through that night, and he said he didn't recollect. So Detective Dinlinger then said that while they were in transport to the police station, the detective was asking him if it was possible he forgot what happened that night, and Jerry said it was possible for people to block out traumatic memories. The detective also said that Jerry began talking about a whole different case of Jodi Huisentruit randomly. This woman had disappeared in Mason County, Iowa in 1995. Jodi was a 27-year-old, beautiful blonde news anchor who overslept, was running late for work, told coworkers she would be there, and then never made it there. There were signs of a struggle in the parking lot outside of her apartment. This was 16 years after Michelle's murder and 2 hours away. And by 2001, Jodi had been legally declared dead, even though she had not been found. This was a strange little tidbit in the interrogation that we will speak more about in a moment. But Michael Allison then testified, and he was a man who had bunked with Jerry in jail. He said that Jerry had told him that he wished he had listened to his dad and cleaned up after himself.
At that time, I think it was 79, he said, or in that area, that no one was thinking about a DNA as far as it being a possibility.
Another statement that this inmate said was that they were playing cards one time and he was beating Jerry. Jerry was getting mad. And
he had told me if I keep beating him in pinochle, he was going to have to take me to the mall.
Michael said that Jerry felt like no matter what happened in this case, he won because he had the opportunity to be with his family after all of these years. However, Michael might not have been the most reliable witness. He had been convicted of drug trafficking, of trafficking illegal aliens across the border, of conspiracy to commit mail fraud, and at that time he was even facing charges of conspiracy to distribute meth. Prosecutors claimed that Jerry had acted with malice, that he was willfully, deliberately, with premeditation and a specific intent to kill, that his use of gloves was evidence of premeditation. After 3 hours of deliberation,
we, the jury, find the defendant, Jerry Lynn Burns, guilty of the charge of murder in the first degree, dated this 24th day of February 2020.
Michelle's older sister said that she wished that their parents could have been there to see this. She and her husband were so grateful for all of the work throughout 40 years, saying that they had left Cedar Rapids, but Cedar Rapids had never left them. This was Michelle's day, and she finally got justice.
Well, we got the call about 6 o'clock in the morning from my mother, and she had waited. She was respectful of our trying to get some sleep. She told us in words that you could almost not understand that my sister had been murdered. And of course, we took off from Davenport, where we lived at that time. We had a 4-year-old son, made arrangements for him, and went to Cedar Rapids. And the first couple of weeks were truly surreal. It was something that you could not believe was happening. As the details of the case were made known to us, my mother had to go and identify the body even before we got there. It was beyond awful.
Tell us what it was like sitting in that courtroom while this case played out in front of you.
For me, it was deja vu, and this is a very personal response because I'm a civil trial lawyer and I tried cases in that courtroom for 30 years. So, and I hadn't been back since. And so walking into that courtroom, sitting on the other side of the bar in a case that involved my wife and I personally was absolutely surreal. It was like a dime store novel. I couldn't believe it.
It was amazing to be in the room, actually, with the person who's accused of killing my sister. That was an amazing thing for me and very emotional. And I was very hopeful, though, because I did believe that the DNA was going to be dispositive. This chapter is over. We know who did it, and we know a little bit of why, and that it wasn't one of her friends who hated her or had a grudge. It was some impersonal person who had their own issues.
Jerry was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, and 3 months later, his attorney did file a motion for a new trial saying that his rights were violated. Now, this was denied, and Jerry's daughter then spoke out to the news saying that she would have never expected this from her father, and she doesn't believe it. She was asked how her dad was supposed to remember how his DNA would be on her after 40 years. Jerry's brother, Don, then said that Jerry worked at a dealership where they made Buick cars, which could be why his DNA would be on the year shift. Detective Denlinger responded to this, saying, "Did that dress go to the dealership too?" But on November 5th of 2023, investigators in Delaware were called to the scene of human remains in a field near Manchester, Iowa. This would be identified as Brian Burns, Jerry's cousin who had been missing for 10 years. It has still not been revealed how he died, and investigators have said that there is no evidence to suggest Jerry was involved in his cousin's death. Do you believe he was involved, though? What about his first wife's suicide back in 2008? How strange is it that his cousin vanished the same day that Michelle had been murdered by him 34 years prior? Does he have more victims that aren't his family members? Was he involved in Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance that he randomly brought up while being interrogated? No evidence has been found to link him to that case either, and he told journalist Steve Ridge that he was never in or through Mason City and denied any involvement in Jodi's case. But he also denied involvement in Michelle's murder, which he has been found guilty of. So did he randomly kill a young woman again 16 years later? It's so sad to me that this 18-year-old who had so much life ahead of her just had it ripped away for no reason at all and was just brutally killed and attacked in that parking lot. And I wish that we knew more about if she actually knew Jerry, if they had any sort of relationship or connection, or this was just a complete random attack, but it seems that he will never tell what actually happened and why. We may never know his motive. However, some, especially those who know Jerry, are very adamant that just because they found DNA on her doesn't mean that he was the killer, that she was in the mall, that she was, all over the food court and in the stores that the Burns family also went to during that time. Do you think it could be as simple as that some of his DNA got on her while she was shopping? I think that would be very coincidental for that to have happened. Gotten the DNA on her dress, and then, if his DNA really was on the gear shift because he worked that dealership, that's a little too far-fetched to believe. But I really wish that they would reveal more about his cousin's death. The same day that he murdered Michelle. Did Brian say something to him about it? Was he triggered that day and killed his cousin? What actually occurred? Or was that just a coincidence? Let me know your thoughts. This case is so strange, but Michelle Martinko solved her own murder. And what an amazing woman she was, or girl she was, when she was alive and also in her death. But don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces.